Corruption as a cancer can kill all of us.
Knowing that it's easier to do the wrong thing than the right thing is what we need to move away from.
You need norm disruptors, people who take on the cost of doing the right thing.
You need to take those steps yourself and ensure that in my world, I conduct myself in the manner that recognizes what I want to see from citizens.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, the 7th largest globally. In 1950, there were fewer than 40 million people. It's estimated that the population is now more than 230 million. In this time, Nigeria has risen to be the 4th biggest economy in Africa, a key player not just across the continent but globally. In this episode, I'll be reflecting on a trip I made last month for 10 years of work that Chatham House has been doing on combating corruption in the country. We went to Lagos, but then held a climactic conference in Abuja, the capital. And when I was there, I spoke to major players in the current government, former ministers, and other insiders who were keen to talk about the challenges of fighting corruption. You'll also hear me describing behind-the-scenes moments from the conference. Just before we get down to talk to people, I'm walking through the centre, big domed building with a lot of light coming in with water in the middle. Some people at the end having tea and coffee, but that is very discreetly at the end because many are fasting because of Ramadan.
Yet corruption remains prevalent and a problem at a systemic level in our country. So, a key thing that addresses that is actually when a people finally say to themselves, this is too costly for all of us. Corruption as a cancer can kill all of us.
That was former Education Minister Dr. Obiageli Ezekwesili, who gave the electrifying keynote speech on what's been happening over the last 25 years and how pervasive corruption has become. And Chatham House held the conference to launch an extensive report into combating corruption, which was the culmination of 10 years' work in Nigeria. And it was led by my colleague, Dr. Leena Koni Hoffmann. She grew up in Abuja, now Nigeria's capital, and she's joining me today. Leena, you were there at the conference. Have we reached that moment that Dr. Obi was talking about when people rise up and say, this is enough?
Hi, Bronwen. It's great to join you today. And it was really quite a deep and meaningful set of conversations that we had in Abuja a couple of weeks ago. And to your question of have we reached that moment, I think the answer is maybe unsatisfactory. And that is partly the reason why we had that kind of stakeholder conference and the theme being renewing Nigeria's anti-corruption agenda. It was retrospective, so looking at 25 years of anti-corruption frameworks, agencies, policies, and reform efforts. But it was also prospective. So it's kind of like Nigeria being at a fork in the road, at a critical junction, where there is the option of galvanizing collective action. And that's part of a lot of the recommendations that were presented in the report that we launched, or unfortunately continuing on, a path of deepening and increasingly endemic corruption. And I'm sure we'll talk about it more closely later, but the kinds of corruption that persist being deeply corrosive to Nigeria's democracy and hindering development.
You say unsatisfactory. That may be putting it a little bit mildly. Let's hear a little bit more from Dr. Obi about why Nigeria has come to have such a problem with corruption, and then I'd love your thoughts on that.
By the time of 1960, which was independence, corruption was already, colonial management of the bureaucracy also had its own, we in fact do say to hold the British accountable for introducing corruption into our public service and then going away, and it multiplied. So you had that colonial period, corruption in the bureaucracy, in the way that the country was run. But By the time the politicians gained independence, the corruption ratcheted up. It was no longer occasional incidents. From the studies that have been done on a periodic history basis to understand the physiology of corruption in our country.
So, Leena, let's go back to the roots of this and look at why Nigeria has got such a problem with corruption. Obviously not the only country, but it is marked. From what you know, is Dr. Obi right?
I'd say there is a great deal of truth to a lot of the statements that Dr. Obi made about the role of, just the extractive and centralized nature of colonialism as it was practiced in places such as Nigeria, to the ways in which political and economic institutions have evolved and being endemically corrupt. I think there's a lot of work done by, for example, Professor Darren Ochemeglu at MIT, looking at the relationship between colonial history and types of corruption. So, the types of institutions that emerge in that context, there is a lot of evidence to support that. You have an acceleration or transfer of power to elites that perhaps don't have the capacity to govern across large territories, concentration of resources, and you have a whole host of things coming together, and you have this unfortunate perfect storm. And Nigeria's colonial history doesn't stand alone as reasons for corruption. The extended period under military rule plays a role in
I was
that.
going to ask you exactly this. What role military played in this? Has it made it better or worse?
I think the consensus is that it's made it worse. In the very first report that we launched under the Social Norms and Accountable Governance Project, we highlighted data that showed around about 400 billion US dollars had been misappropriated and taken out of the country's wealth between 1960 and 1999, when Nigeria returned to democracy. So certainly the military, being authoritarian, dictatorial, and unaccountable, those years under military rule fueled corruption. And it also coincided with the discovery of oil in Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the largest oil producing countries in Africa. So just the economy or political economy that is within Nigeria's oil industry and just the rent-seeking opportunities for political elites further fueled Nigeria's corruption problem.
Make some important points there. Obviously, this is much studied, much analysed, much contested territory, but you make really important points about the oil, the military, the colonial structures. Let's go on to how this affects daily life and the actual impact on people. I was interested in your report, which said that you found in this extensive research that Nigerians, most that you found in your surveys, oppose corruption and would welcome support in resisting it.
That's really true, Bronwen. And we've seen consistently across our surveys, our studies, and interviews, one of the consistent trends in the data is that most Nigerians, oftentimes between 8 to 9, so it's a majority of Nigerians, find different forms of corruption unacceptable. They find it morally unacceptable, find it corrosive to life and welfare. And in various other opinion polls and other surveys by other organizations, Afrobarometer, UNODC, corruption always features really high up there as unacceptable and a key problem for Nigerians.
Let's talk a little bit about the real impact it has on the daily lives of ordinary Nigerians. And one of the stories which really resonated with me at the conference was from Hadiza Bala Usman, who's a special advisor to the president of Nigeria. She's held other very distinguished government jobs. And she had a father who was a politician and historian, so comparatively well known. She told the conference about how corruption just made it easier to do the wrong thing in order to have an easy life.
When I was learning how to drive, my father took us to the driving school. The people said, oh, just come and get it. When he came himself, they now stopped everything, took us through the whole rigmarole, and everybody was laughing at us that you didn't have to do this. But because it was your father that came, they decided to do the proper process. So knowing that it's easier to do the wrong thing than the right thing is what we need to move away from. Government processes that require permits, approval should be demystified so people are able to do it. Your default is not to be wrong, but when being right takes you years to get anything done, you now decide, you know what, you are the fool going through the process. Just go to Nasara and get your fake driver's license and move on.
Because she's talking about where other people in the driving license office thought that her father was going to insist that they did it properly, so they resumed doing it that way rather than the informal way that they would normally have done it. Leena, how have you seen this affect daily life? I'm thinking things like driving along the road or access to places in schools or hospitals.
Corruption and the type of corruption that Hadiza describes severely impacts on people's everyday life. You have a context in which people feel apathetic because of how prevalent and resilient corruption is, that they no longer engage with institutions, political institutions, or trust them. There is a whole life cycle that is affected from birth to retirement. One of the cases that we highlight in the report was the case of over 2 billion US dollars stolen from the police pension fund, and how that corruption case went through the judicial system very slowly. The court decision at the end of it was a pittance in terms of the penalty. And even when the anti corruption agency, the Economic Financial Crimes Commission, challenged the decision, it took several years for it to be back in court again. So it gives you a picture of just how challenging it is and difficult it is for you to actually prosecute. Highlights to an extent the difficulties that anti-corruption agencies face. It's a capacity problem, there are resource problems, but also what I highlight in the report is a lot of these anti-corruption institutions are politicized, at least interfered with politically. So it is the institutions that are impacted, the institutions that are meant to prevent and enforce anti-corruption laws, but it's everyday life. So people do not feel that the rules are going to be applied fairly. So you have a context in which society almost rewards you for breaking the rules. So when there are no consequences for bad behavior, and you see those who win elections or get into office getting away with breaking election laws or stealing elections, you find a context where everyone is trapped almost in this social trap of corruption. That's what the literature calls it, where most people would like to live in a more honest society, but no one wants to take on the initial cost of doing the right thing.
Could you just give me an example? Like, if you want to get a place for your child at a school or you want to get an appointment at a hospital, can you do it without paying a bribe?
It's quite hard to do it without paying a bribe. I think maybe to stretch out a point I was making about the life cycle of corruption, one of the data points that we highlight in the very first report for SNAG was the high levels of infant mortality and maternal mortality in places such as Nigeria. At the time, this was in 2017, 4 out of 10 maternal deaths globally were accounted for in Nigeria. It's still the case you are 4.7 times more likely to die in childbirth in Nigeria than anywhere else in the world. So it's the investments that should be made in hospitals to upgrade hospitals for pregnant women, women about to deliver, to be able to get to hospitals. So it's reflected in the broken healthcare system. It's reflected as well in having access to care. You have to give a bribe if you want urgent care. So you have that petty level, extortionate form of corruption thriving at the level of accessing public services. Nigeria's public education system has been underinvested over the years, not even reaching the levels in which UNESCO require or recommend that government should invest in public education. And that has an effect on the number of schools. Nigeria also has some of the highest number of out of school children.
So if you want to get a place for your child or a place in a better school, then it's easier.
If you give a bribe, it makes it easier to get a place in schools.
I was driving with Tigiste Amari, who's the deputy director of our Africa program, and she was saying, look, it can be the difference between having the day you planned or driving along, someone stops you, says you haven't got the right papers, go to these other 3 offices and get the papers, and you lose the day you intended to have. We have a picture of it interfering with people's daily life. We were hearing it easier to do the wrong thing than the right thing, despite what you found in your survey, which is many, many people wanting to do the right thing. I'd like to just bring this together at the end with a look at what, if anything, can be done to drive through improvements, to bring together the rallying cry that we heard at the beginning from Dr. Obi about the feelings of many people that they want to rise up and say, this is enough. And we were in a round table, you were there, Leena, with civil society groups, and Tigiste, Deputy Africa head, said to one man, well, give us some hope. And he replied, honestly, it is hopeless. And everyone started laughing. But actually then, a lot of examples came out of what people are doing. I'm thinking of things, including in another gathering we had in Lagos of entrepreneurs, fintech, where Nigerians have developed a lot of technology and apps to move money around, to cut out bureaucracy and so cut out the demands for payment and so on. And one of the many interesting things I read in your report was the discussion around pluralistic ignorance, when individuals disapprove of corruption but they engage in it because they think everyone else does. So what are the kind of steps you're seeing that are actually helpful?
Thank you for mentioning what is also another trend that was quite consistent across all of the studies that we've done under the Social Norms and Accountable Governance project, is this phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance. And it just simply means people being mistaken about what other people believe or do. So you have this false consensus where a group of people or public society think that everybody finds a behavior acceptable, even though they personally find it unacceptable. So, across a range of corruption behaviors, we found that petty bribery, which is this day to day form of corruption, hampers people, makes life cumbersome, and so on. That around petty bribery behavior, there is a great deal of pluralistic ignorance. There is more capacity to galvanize collective action around our shared beliefs that corruption is unacceptable. Like the examples you saw in Lagos, there are indeed pockets of hope, or at least sites where you can be hopeful that various civil society groups, coalitions are forming that are leveraging technology to engage with citizens in community monitoring of projects and asking questions of elected officials. So there are these strands and these opportunities for shifting gears on anti corruption in Nigeria. So there is definitely more that can be done. And just a final point of a dynamic that I highlight in the report is the role of integrity actors.
Who do you mean by them?
Integrity actors and role models are people who simply model the type of behavior you would like to see in society. They model positive values of integrity, of honesty, of civic duty, of fairness, of accountability. And is consistent in the literature on collective action when you have a collective action problem. So most people would like to live in an honest society, but it's too costly for you to be the one honest person in a dishonest police department. So when you have a collective action problem, you need role models, you need first adopters, you need norm disruptors, people who take on the cost of doing the right thing. So, what we highlight in the research and in the report that we launched is that there are these people in Nigeria who are doing the right thing. People in government, law enforcement in various sectors of life, local, subnational, and the federal level. Oftentimes, though, these individuals are isolated. They don't have a sense of the impact of their actions. So, resisting corruption, refusing to jimmy a process or to accept a bribe and all of that. So, one of the key recommendations from the research is building networks, connecting such individuals, connecting such communities of good practice. So you have shared solidarity, you leverage a network effect, and you can galvanize and mobilize collective action and pressure to shift Nigeria from this social trap and this status.
This sounds great, but as you say, the cost can be incredibly high if you're an individual. I'm thinking of where this goes beyond everyday corruption into some of the criminal extortion, frankly, that is behind the wave of kidnapping. And one woman was telling us just casually at the round table we were holding that her mother had got kidnapped a few weeks before, and they contacted the police, who said, we don't have enough money for the fuel, which may or may not have been a request for money. But anyway, the police were not leaping to it. So then the family paid off the kidnappers and got the mother back. And you were discussing with your dad, you wanted to see him, and he lives in a rural area, who was least likely to get kidnapped if one travelled to the other. I think you decided between the two of you, he was least likely. So you did meet up, didn't you?
Yes, we did. He did come. He did come to visit me in Abuja. Yeah,
He came on the bus, is that right?
yeah.
How can you encourage people to resist this corruption and extortion when the cost can be so high if you've got a family member kidnapped?
Yeah, it's not an easy set of circumstances or set of challenges that Nigeria has. Indeed, something that we've highlighted consistently across the research is just, this very point that corruption avoidance is simply too high. For most individuals, for most sets of actors, given the kinds of risks people face both professionally and personally. And a lot of the role models that we spoke with, the integrity role models and or integrity champions that we spoke with, spoke about really, really difficult risks that they had to take on and just personal safety issues that they were, and even risks to their family and so on. So it's not an easy ask to impose on any individual. So, hence the argument for a more connected coalition approach that people are sharing the costs. So, since it is costly, that people share the costs of doing the right thing. There are certainly entrepreneurs, norm disruptors who have a higher threshold of enduring those risks. And we spoke to about 21 of them. And there's certainly more than that. My father, who you mentioned, he's an integrity role model. He never collected a bribe. I grew up in the house with, when we were young, men with giant, this traditional dress, they call it the agbada, coming to the house with briefcases. He was an accountant in the Ministry of Power and Steel. So he was in a very, very lush position to collect bribes, but he never collected a bribe. So there are millions of Nigerians who live with integrity and with honesty, but oftentimes they do this in isolation. So the key argument of the report is the kind of support systems, and a lot of these role models spoke about not having the kind of support systems professionally and personally.
How helpful? Where are the churches and the mosques in this?
Thank you for mentioning that because, yeah, the question about the role of informal institutions, particularly traditional.
They're just not governmental.
Yes, yes. So there's trust. That's also something fascinating that came out of the research, is that while political institutions and political actors are distrusted greatly, religious leaders and traditional leaders and traditional institutions have high levels of trust. So there is a key role there for traditional actors and traditional institutions, as well as religious, in providing, particularly credible ones, motivated ones, in providing that kind of moral leadership, in highlighting the kinds of values. There's no way you can have a conversation about values and ethical conduct without bringing these social institutions in the conversation. Yeah.
In your view, Leena, do the churches and mosques fulfill that role?
Some do, but I guess the landscape of religious institutions is so diverse in Nigeria. You have everything from the Orthodox to the charismatic religious institutions, the more traditional Islamic institutions, and the various Muslim brotherhoods. So it is such a varied landscape that no single solution or single form of engagement will work. But there's certainly faith-based organizations who are working in the anti-corruption space. And some of the recommendations we have made to those organizations is providing that moral leadership and being a platform for getting citizens to engage with governing institutions. So while citizens don't trust governing institutions, religious institutions can be that connecting tissue, can be that platform for greater civic engagement, for greater engagement around elections, greater engagement around procurement, oversight, and those kinds of communal platforms and groups that actually hold government accountable. They certainly play a role in that and can play a greater role in that.
Just as we bring this together towards the end, do you think this is a problem that has to be solved from the top, or is the top the problem?
The top is certainly part of the solution. Visible actors often signal what is accepted in society. So you certainly need, that signaling from the top, so higher levels of government, the federal government, from the presidential, the executive branch to the legislative branch, and so on. So given their visibility in society, they play a huge role in signaling what behaviors are accepted. And when they face consequences for bad behavior, so for rigging an election, you need a strong judicial system to hold them accountable and a legislative system. So you need these checks and balances. So, that signaling from the top is absolutely crucial. Unfortunately, as has been the case for Nigeria, there's been a lot of brokenness in terms of leadership at the top and a lot of institutions that are meant to hold leadership accountable. So, electoral institutions and judiciary institutions have been weakened in this context of the institutional weakening of corruption. Yeah.
I did think at points during our trip of that old joke, why hire a lawyer, just hire the judge. But we actually heard a lot that was very positive, a joke that spans countries, I should say. But we did hear a lot that was positive about the court system, including people using increasingly AI to simplify access to it, and people just finding ways to get it to work better. So we've been talking about the top, but a lot of what we've been talking about is getting community action to resist this. And I just want to bring us back to Hadiza Bala-Usman, who had this to say on individual responsibility.
I think fundamentally, you need to be the change you want to be. You need to take those steps yourself and ensure that in my world, I conduct myself in the manner that recognizes what I want to see from citizens. So when you walk into the airport, you want to go the front line. You have the idea that you're VIP, you deserve to be treated better. You have the idea that circumventing processes and having plugins in everything is the right thing to do. We must discourage that by allowing the proper process to happen.
Let me make clear what she was telling. It was a tale, and she went into an airport and the check-in wasn't working, and the people said, oh, you can go through the VIP channel. And she said, no, I want to experience the real thing in order to help build up pressure to get that working. Well, do start with the airport. If you're arriving, I was with Tigisti, as I said, arriving in Lagos, and we were asked a couple of times very quietly for money that might help us get more quickly through the visa queue and then to essentially to get luggage out of the hall. We didn't, and things did flow normally, if slowly, but it is a reminder of how much part of life it is. Leena, If you could implement just one change tomorrow to make a real impact on corruption in Nigeria, what would it be?
That's a big question. But I think if there was one thing, I think to the point that we were making about the very visible and development and democracy damaging types of corruption that we see in Nigeria, particularly the elite driven corruption, the ones involving huge sums of money that are siphoned from the treasury. I think a key area that Nigeria needs reform and overhaul is in its election system. Over several cycles of elections, there have been fewer and fewer people participating, and the last election, I think, was 29% of those registered to vote voted. So it's signaling to the point of a lack of trust in elections and systems that are meant to hold people account. So around elections, around party financing, the amount of money in Nigerians' politics, I would start there. You can't start to reduce these kind of damaging forms of corruption, these elite forms of corruption, without addressing consequences at that level, political consequences and electoral consequences.
I think that's a really good example. I'm persuaded. I was thinking as you were talking, well, maybe the police, but the police is something, I mean, many countries, including advanced economies, find very hard to get right. These people with enormous power over their fellow citizens, not always paid very much, and with all the opportunities that that can present. So I'm not going to ask for a magic wand in that direction. I'm persuaded by your call for more on the electoral system. We're going to have to stop there. This is obviously a huge subject, and Chatham House is delighted to have spent so much time, over a decade, on this, and I actually want to thank the MacArthur Foundation that helped us do much of that work. For our listeners, we hope that you've enjoyed this week as much as we've enjoyed putting it together, and do leave us a review. We love hearing what topics you want us to cover as well. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn, and she and I will discuss any suggestions you put forward in the chat. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Speak to you next week. Goodbye for now.